I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Ellie Grigsby is a PhD student at the University of Reading, examining the psychosocial space that facially disfigured soldiers lived in following sustainment of life-changing injuries. Ellie is responsible for the creation, design, and fundraising of the UK's first memorial dedicated to those who suffered painful and life-altering facial disability during the First World War. Please note that this presentation includes images that highlight the realities of injuries sustained during conflict. So I'd now like to hand over to you, Ellie, and I will get your presentation ready.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Okay, just checking you can see that okay?
Yep, perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. I'd like to start today touching upon briefly some semantics. There is a debate around the continuation of the term facial disfigurement, with many calling for an exchange of language to visible difference or facial injuries. Last year, I guess, edited the story submission page for Face Equality International, and they were campaigning for the way visibly different people are currently treated to be seen as a breach of human rights. Language can let us down, and language evolves to address outdated or marginalising terms. And there are problems with both of those and positives. So it can be a challenge to find something that upholds diverse perspectives whilst also realising words meant different things, and application of modern terminology to times gone can sometimes cause friction. For me, facial injuries may not imply the permanency that, say, disfigurement does, and visible difference without discussion is not entirely clear at times of what it can include. And that is something that has repetitively come up when I've conducted interviews with descendants, asking them if they would be happy to begin describing their grandfather or uncle with these words. In fact, every single descendant rejected the adoption of the term. For the purpose of today, because facial disfigurement was used in the era I'm studying, and the family that I'm going to touch upon shortly specifically wanted me to use those terms, I will use those in this talk. I want to hover for a little while on this photograph that you can see here on the screen. I actually have a copy of this photograph in my direct view behind my computer in my office, pinned to the wall. I decided as soon as I was given it by a relative that I would have that photograph with the feelings I felt when I first saw it, and indeed that I still get when I look at it now, always in my peripheral vision till I finish my research. So I want to introduce you to some of the people in this photograph. The bride and groom there at the front. The groom is Bernard Twin and Maggie, his wife, next to him, and this is obviously from their wedding day. Minnie is Bernard's mother, and she's at the far left there, looking very radiant. And next to her is Anita, and Anita is her daughter, the brother of Bernard, equally looking very joyous. And Bernard was actually a twin, so his brother, if you can see, is at the far back towards the right. So they were the twins. And he's filled with so much joy, his eyes are actually closed whilst he smiles, baring all of his teeth. The most important person in the photograph for me, which may have taken you a little while to spot, and that man is Sydney. And Sydney Twin's behind his son, the wife of Minnie and the father of the groom. If you look closely, you'll see he's wearing a flesh-coloured eye patch. Now, I interviewed the granddaughter of Sydney and Minnie, Mary, as well as her two sisters, Claire and Jane, last summer. And she brought a collection of family photographs to the Premier Inn that we met in near Gatwick for the interview, and this was amongst them. There's so much going on in this photograph. It encapsulates my fascination in the subject, that so much was there in plain sight. And it's extraordinary there's such a strong multi-dimensional characteristic to one singular picture as a tangible artifact recording history. We have Maggie's brother, who represents a lot. He who gave her away, at the far left at the very back, directly next to Sydney. is the only one that's looking at Sydney, hiding behind his son on his wedding day. Everybody else is joyous, facing forwards. They're very much in the moment. And you could think that this is an outtake, as I first did, a candid shot that just didn't include every face amongst the kerfuffle of trying to get everybody centre. But it isn't. This photograph positioning was deliberate. So the wedding photographer was spoken to and told not to ask Sydney to come forward. Sydney spent the rest of his life, after becoming facially disfigured during the First World War, always positioning himself half in and half out of family photographs. And everybody in the family was introduced to this unwritten axiom to never encourage him to expose more, but they always knew to capture half of him, or the bottom of his suit or his leg and his shoe, particularly half of his face, amongst the fullness of his family. He never refused a photograph, which I found interesting, but he always wanted to be part of it. But it only meant he would be part of it if you only saw part of him. I was first introduced to the descendants of the twin family in 2017, and they moved me profoundly. Whilst researching how these veterans have been remembered in the country and worldwide, at a time when we were rolling forward to the centenary of the First World War, I was baffled to see that a war memorial for the facially disfigured patients just didn't exist. So I set about changing that. And before taking you through that process to bring it to fruition, that took me just short of 3 years, of which I worked as an independent. I wasn't attached to any funding or schemes or charities. I will introduce you to a crude history of the facially disfigured, and I'll end with an overview of my current research. If you don't mind, the next slide, please, Charlotte. Thank you. I first became involved in this topic when I was people watching in France. I was inside a museum dedicated everything First World War, and I came across a temporary exhibition. The exhibition contained material on facial wounds and permanent disfigurement. The placement of the exhibition was where my fascination first sparked. Inside what looked like an alcove or a side exit, there was this sort of intimate space with extraordinary material that I had never been exposed to after studying the war for many years at this time. It was not signposted, and I found myself instantly stimulated with the content. I sat down afterwards and watched guests leaving the room without actually exploring the content, wincing with very visible facial expressions and showing outward and very unapologetic repulsion, as well as some comments of shock and horror that going in would just be an ordeal and was just genuinely intolerable for a lot of the visitors, for the average person. I actually wrote to the museum several months later, asking if I could speak to the curator responsible for it or actually come back to France to visit. I was told that the temporary exhibition actually was dismantled and closed earlier than planned, and from that very moment I was hooked. Growing up, I was always intrigued by the repetitive words said at each remembrance every November that have stood the test of time. We often hear Robert Binion's For the Fallen, that you will all be very familiar with. And for today, I've just taken an excerpt and shortened it. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. To the end they remain. I recently wrote a chapter on the facially disfigured as old men, as men in their 80s and 90s after reading decades worth of their pension files each. I decided this needs to be adapted, and it prefaces that chapter, and I would quite like it to preface this talk, well, I feel it perfectly does as well. They grew old, just like us. Age wearied them, and the years condemned. To the end they remain. Next slide, please, Charlotte. Thank you. Chemical gas could burn a man's face to the point he was unrecognisable and render him blind. Machine gun fire punctured flesh at incredibly high velocities in multiple zones at once. Shell splinters and fragments were searing hot temperatures and dragged with it the mud, dirt, bacteria from the trenches that could quite literally tear a face completely clean off. A key part of recognising the complexities of treating these injuries is to bear in mind penicillin was yet to be discovered, so gangrene setting in was deadly and quite often could be a race against time. Hemorrhages were catastrophic, and blood transfusion technology for the majority of the war period was widely unaccepted and untested. It just wasn't quite there yet. And so men choking to death as their mouths pulled with blood has come up often in my research, as well as shockingly, the medics at first were carrying men on stretchers laying on their backs, soon realising they needed to be laid differently, as once they'd safely got them off the battlefield, they had choked to death. Many soldiers couldn't get off the battlefield immediately. Medics couldn't reach them. Some were unconscious for days in shell holes. Many were laying in pits full of the dead and dying, screaming out, asking to be saved, as they had in fact survived. Soldiers were swaddled in bandages, unable to speak or eat for days, sometimes weeks, before receiving any medical care. And work done at casualty clearing stations was emergency, not specialist. So it involved a lot around patchwork care rather than aesthetic at those early stages, which often meant tight scars and flesh sitting in the wrong places that made the job for the plastic surgeon, sometimes up to years later, even more complex as he needed to reopen old healed scars. This is without mentioning how anaesthesia was still being tried and tested, and it was not rare for men to die on the table before the operation even started, or to even wake up too soon. Working from imperfect data, Sophie Delaport estimates that the number of disfigured French soldiers following the war stands at around 300,000, with a likely figure for France at 500,000. This then makes Britain's official statistic at 60,500 in comparison, a very odd statistic. This was something that I had to look into, and when you realise the British statistic only includes injuries to the head or eye as categories of facial disfigurement, you realise injuries to the cheek, to the jaw, to the chin, to the mouth, and to the nose were omitted. From this, we can conclude that facial recognition in regard to national collation of data is something that must be considered under a lens with a political agenda. Sir Harold Gillies was responsible for pushing the world's leading centre of plastics. After spending time on the front line identifying a specialist hub was needed in its entirety, as facial cases were swamping mainstream hospitals, and so acute cases had to be streamlined. Gillies used his own money to buy what looked like suitcase paper tags and got these out to the front lines. Any man that needed specialist care was tagged and eventually found his way to Sidcup. Built in less than 6 months from the ground up, Queen's Hospital in Sidcup, Kent opened its doors in August 1917. Now, looking at aerial shots of the hospital and annotated diagrams, it shows it was built featuring a very unique sort of horseshoe style central core with radiating connecting wards, like outreaching sort of spokes of a wheel that housed boardwalks that meant fluidity and connectivity was achieved. With administration in between the prongs of the horseshoe and the kitchen quarters adjacent, the horseshoe centre featured ramps feeding off into each ward, connecting every single fork line to the theatres in the heart of it, meaning emergencies could be handled efficiently and promptly, despite the hospital being set in acres of green. So evidently the far-reaching acres of land was for escapism rehabilitation purposes, not just for patient capacity holding. The ward sister hut fed directly into the core, meaning access to every patient in every ward in a singular flowing movement was possible. Once the impressiveness settles, cogitating how architectural design impacted the minds of patients is an interesting concept, which I do explore in my PhD research, looking at the possibility of institutionalism effects on the patients. Doctors' rounds and being transported to operating theatres straightforwardly if an emergency arose became very doable, as the operating theatres were in the centre. This meant without mentioning that they were sort of existing and healing around perpetual surgeries on others. The positioning of their beds in the wards meant nobody was forgotten, and it also facilitated a physical connection to other patients. They may have wanted to spend time with one another or monitor progress of friends in different wards. And having those connecting boardwalks made this so simple for them. Moreover, patients shared space as row upon row, they saw other patients just like them, directly either side of them and directly opposite, facing them, aligning with their own bed. They were not in private rooms. A pivotal difference being a patient at Queen's rather than another mainstream hospital was because it was specialist and in a remote, idyllic location. There was no foot traffic from staff, patients, and visitors of varying departments like we would be used to now, or just simply other walks of life. It was a very insular existence where they only saw other patients that experienced what they had, looked like they did, and felt like they did. They all understood the sensations brought about by long-term commitment to facial surgery, and with a changeover of a smaller pool of staff on site, they would have come to know them all on a very personal level, and this almost entirely eradicated collision with strangers. It's thought that around 11,000 operations took place here, and for many reasons this is probably now impossible to finalise. And it is unclear how many men passed through the doors, but surviving material indicates around 8,000, but it could be more. The hospital was split in national ward lines, so you had the Canadians, New Zealanders, Australian, and the British. But my research shows these boundary lines were crossed and patients from outside the Commonwealth countries were admitted in as a minority, which has not actually been discussed before. Those files have been hidden in plain sight for many years. Being a patient at Queen's would have been incredibly tough. We never would really describe a person as living inside a hospital, as that's not part of what we understand to be a patient, as there is a temporality to the status unless we die there. With the average hospital stay at Queen's around 2 years, these men were living on site. They were dressed in patient uniforms, and benches around the proximity of the hospital and the local town of Sidcup were painted blue. Some see these with qualities of privacy, but I would argue it was more of a social apartheid, and it's part of our unpalatable history. Mirrors were banned on some facial wards, and some were known to have actually lost consciousness when they snuck an illicit peek of their face from a shaving mirror when they got hold of the contraband. Visits from relatives were also explicitly advised to be postponed for the apparent emotional well-being of both them and the patient. Yet we now know introducing the mirror in a phased, controlled process and involving loved ones in the recovery, as well as psychologists, is now a non-negotiable of rehabilitation. When medical knowledge failed and couldn't keep pace with war, prosthetics were introduced, or tin masks as they were more commonly referred to conceal that unfixable damage. For the purpose of today, this isn't something I can go into in depth, as it's a very wealthy area of discussion and debate. But whilst the mask strove to present both a realism and breed a familiarity through so-called restoration, the bar protruding from the side of a prosthetic to keep the glasses leg reminisce somewhat of Frankenstein's bolts. They weren't capable of pigmentation change to age, movement, and of course, once hooked, whether intentionally or by accident, it meant that there was always underneath unchangeable, painful, and psychologically challenging wounds. But it is worth realising only a small minority got hold of these. To give you a rough idea, outside of the two key studios in Paris and London, with little evidence that any places on such scale existed other than those two, Parisian production was at 185. The London studio inside the 3rd London General Hospital was far more efficient with production and open longer. So even if we quadrupled this figure, reality smarts that not even 1,000 were probably made for anything up to potentially 500,000 disfigured for Britain. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. My first port of call with the memorial was to design something to approach the hospital with. These are some of the first original sketches for the memorial as it developed. The first ever sketch was done by me on a bit of kitchen greaseproof paper, but I ended up losing it, so I'm absolutely gutted I did. But I did get an E for art, so perhaps it was for the best with that one. But one of the first offers I got, you see there central, and there's a copy on the far right corner there, was to be, it was essentially to be more of a plaque, I guess, to be two-dimensional and fixed to the wall. And the price for this came in, which very much surprised me, with a big range of £10,000 to £20,000. So very quickly, as this was a new subject for me anyway to learn about, I had to really sharpen up pretty quick and do my own research on costings. So I moved away from that first artist. And doing this, it allowed me to expand on the materials that I could use and develop then the size of the memorial and the feelings that it would command to be in the presence of it. So I would argue cost does affect impact, which I think is very interesting. If I could have the next slide, please. So this was the memorial dismantled in the stonemason's workshop. So you can see the base there, the biggest photo, with the central screw. And that was where the centre pillar would be fixed to rise up. You'll notice there a grey concrete hat and shirt that was offered to me. It was actually handmade to be fixed at the base, but I actually chose to abandon incorporation of this to the design. I felt it was very inanimate, and I just wasn't happy with the aesthetic of what I had in mind, so I rejected that. And I ended up having bronze boots made with the same technique of the bust that sits on the top of the pillar, which you will see some visuals of. You can also see there the stencils that I went down to Portsmouth for the man who prints them on these large sheets, which was rigorously checked for grammar and spelling mistakes and things like that before being sandblasted onto the panels. And the stonemason done the writing free of charge as his contribution. The majority of the material costs for the memorial were either hugely discounted, some of it up to half price, or donated for free. And the memorial is made of Indian black granite, which was chosen for pretty much its durability and how long lasting it is. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. The inscription was worked on for several months amongst sort of a five-way team. So there was myself, Dr. Andrew Banji, who is responsible for the Gillies Digital Archive and rescuing a lot of archival material in the early 2000s. Dr. Emily Mayhew, a leading historian of the wounded, and Professor Richard Grayson, a leading historian of the First World War, and then lastly, members of the Oxley's NHS Trust. We felt working as a hybrid would produce something sharp rather than it just be something that I did singularly. Between us, we tweaked the piece I initially wrote to develop it, which at times was difficult as it exposed different approaches of language use with reference to what we spoke about at the beginning, and perception of the narrative across age bands, which is something I now actually discuss in my PhD, that I believe only certain generations can ask certain questions. The inscription is split across 3 panels, so essentially the 3, 6 and 9 o'clock faces. And whilst there's an infinite amount to say with this topic, I wanted to have text that enforced a movement upon the spectator. I wanted it to be something they had to sort of oscillate around to see a different angle of the bust above eye line every time you switch positions. So even text layout was deliberate to manipulate human behaviour, I guess, to encourage an experience at the memorial. Something I've not spoken about to date before with the inscription is there was a quotation that I wanted to include from Sister Catherine Black's memoirs. You can see that there along the right-hand side. I was told by representatives of the Trust that the new cancer unit would mean movement and foot traffic from cancer patients. And so this graphic description would never be permitted to be on one of the panels, as it would cause upset to them specifically. Now, the cancer unit is an entirely different site of the grounds, and you actually need to enter a new reception and courtyard doors to get to the memorial. It boiled down to a choice of stump the memorial from being realised or choose a completely different quote, which I ended up doing. This is something I'd be very willing to discuss or answer any questions on at the end, but I think realising at this stage now, with honesty, when this story is retold, that choices did have to be made by me that were not favourable at times. And the fading of history, as well as dilution of certain elements, were things that I was juggling. Next slide, please. Thank you. We move on to the top bronze sculptor, done by the technique of 3D printing. So it was done by, you can probably see there, he's got a sort of handheld device, which I probably think by now is already sort of outdated. But he done it essentially by walking really slowly around the model, and it flashed repetitively, and it produced 3D scans of his face, which I can show you on the next slide, please. Thank you very much. It creates visuals that the 3D printer used to essentially pour the liquid bronze into. The scans were sent back to a contact that the artist had in the Netherlands, and the mould was shipped back to us in London. So those initial grainy visuals you saw there were transformed into these really smooth computerized images, giving me a far better end result. Now, if you look really, really closely, you can see a tiny speck there on the model's nose. And this was a result of what was like a sort of glitch with the scanning process. And when it was poured, the bust actually came out with what looked like a tiny air bubble. So it shows how precise the sort of transferal process actually is. And it was a non-negotiable for me that humanness was achieved. Next slide, please. Thank you. The bust went through, I guess, a series of materials, and you can see there that central picture. There's incisions around the neck and the top part of the palm of the hand. But these were buffed out entirely. So you can see here with the final piece how smooth the finish was. Next picture, please, Charlotte. And it shows how it was all finished by hand. The bust for me is the sort of star of the show. It was my nod to the unknown warrior tomb in Westminster and around the world. It's very important to me that he was nameless, and the hand concealed the disfigurement. Not ever seeing the damage was very important to me, because I wanted us to feel like we were inextricably entangled with questions about it that we would just never get answers to, and that we weren't allowed that choice, as we inevitably would, to pass a judgment over it for its severity. And because for most of their lives they didn't let others see what war had done to them, to reinstate it was a taboo. To reinstate the society in which they survived and went on surviving in was not culturally attuned to see them, to be able to listen to them, to understand them, and how facial disfigurement attacked identity, being a complex mental health concept that they just could never understand. And they became sort of invisible, yet visible in so many senses. The helmet that you can see there, fixed to the unknown soldier, is an original Rhodey helmet gifted to me from the Somme Museum in Albert. And a plaque mentioning this is something that actually I'm hoping to raise funds for this year, if I can, to have it fixed to the left side of the memorial. Potentially a great deal of men wore this helmet on the battlefront to protect their heads, and it's the unpalatable reality that a lot of men would have died wearing it too. If I could have the next slide, please. As the design evolved, I wanted boots at the base to symbolise those who walked the first step on the grounds of the hospital as guinea pigs and staff alike. For plastic surgery as a discipline, as the memorial is obviously situated in the cradle of modern plastic surgery as we know it today, I wanted the boots to be disturbed, so that first image there was just a sort of draft of us playing around with visuals. So I wanted them to look worn, one to be upright, one to be fallen, to show somebody stood in them once and took them off, and that they left a heavy imprint. The invisible man and the heavy imprint is to represent that sort of paradoxical relationship disfigured veterans had with the armed forces for me post-injury. We set about the same process with the boots, but the preliminary model was actually, you can see there that picture, they were my dad's old gardening boots. So what we done to adapt them before beginning the same process again was by researching the look of original military uniform boots held by the Imperial War Museum. And I made notes for the artist to try and adapt the best he could to mimic First World War footwear. So you can see there the grey plasticine that was moulded by hand to imitate the tread and the steel cap toe. And details even went to the number of eyelets for the laces and also the height. And similarly, they came out looking very sort of messy after they'd made their way from that wax mould. And they were equally buffed out by hand. If I could have the next slide, please. So you can see there the sort of transition of them and the positioning of one on its side. We had to actually drill holes in the side of the boots for water drainage, bearing in mind the memorial was going to be outside, as stagnant water and rainfall sitting in them could be a problem. Something I find very interesting is whenever I go to visit for maintenance purposes, I always see people using the boots as like vases. So they'll sort of put fresh flowers inside the upright boot. Next slide, please. Thank you. These are photographs taken on the day the memorial was erected. And this correlated by chance with the day that the BBC article went live. So you can see here a selection of some of the press coverage. And I remember standing watching it be built from the glass because it was freezing in November, and getting messages from all around the world. I got messages from soldiers who'd served in Afghanistan, including a maxillofacial surgeon in Afghanistan, up and down the UK, from London to Kent, Wales, Canada, America, Australia, New Zealand. And I do attribute that actually to that BBC article propelling it as news. Every message I got, I've saved, and I actually have a scrapbook detailing everything from every single person that donated to what it looked like at the end for almost the 3 years I've worked on this. Next slide, please. These are some of my favourite shots from the photographer on the day that it was unveiled on the 25th of November 2019. It was unveiled by 3 generations from a family whose relative was treated on site. I had a live performance from a violinist and a piece of immersive acting, you can see her there at the bottom, from the local drama university, as well as the last post was played live by a veteran on the bugle who actually came back 3 years later to play in the exact same spot on the anniversary. I don't know if anyone can see a resemblance or has figured it out yet, but the model for the unknown soldier is actually my brother. So my family legacy is caught up in this too. Next slide, please. This photograph was taken last Remembrance. It was the first time the memorial was used as, I guess I intended it, as a place of mourning, for gathering, for people to conversate and educate. And the Royal British Legion and the local MP held a very small service with help from the local church. And I was told that that would actually be the first year of a continual relationship that the borough of Sidcup, Bexley and the RBL would have with it from now on, incorporating it into their age-old parade through the town, where patients of Queen's once would have walked, taking a break from being inside the hospital. Next slide, please. Finally, before we conclude with some questions, I just want to take you through a brief overview of my ongoing research. My research is concerned with understanding the psychosocial space that predominantly British veterans lived in, but I have had to, in unexpected ways, widen my transnational gaze, following their facial injury and offering a proposal of what life could have been like for them. I'm interested in alienation, being a guinea pig, living with unchanging or worsening disfigurement through failed and successful surgeries, and evolving symptoms and how that potentially impacted the brain, the nervous system, and the body of the facially disfigured. Utilising emotional intelligence with these men is vital for me, and something that I've come to really see a distinct difference between with academic intelligence. And I explore how empathy has been part of my methodological approach to this. And I discuss how the research made me feel and what I needed to do to engage with this properly, and how I've had to look after myself to be able to cope with intense study for 3 years on these men. Looking for any pattern behaviour has been important. So alcoholism, gambling, hypersexuality, suicide ideation, as well as psychosis has surfaced. And looking into patients that refuse to cooperate when hospitalised or to conform to surgical procedures has interested me from the start. Coping mechanisms like the overuse of humour, immediation against the threat posed to them, and their masculine status is proving recurrent. And I'm looking into what part of their injuries were exposed and what remained hidden at home, and how did disfigurement impact upon the ability to love, be loved, relationship breakdown, particularly paternally, as I've heard a few times now with interviews, how fathers return home and their children actually cowered under the table, denying that that man was in fact their father. And I'm particularly interested in changes within romantic relationships and how in some instances they actually formed after injury. A lot of this feeds into prosthetic use and how most recipients, which obviously we touched on, granted was a very small amount, were wary of kind of revealing their injuries to the world, even in death, and were buried in prosthetics. That actually features part of the memorial inscription. And I spoke with one family where on his deathbed, suffering from cancer, he refused even then to take off his prosthetic on his deathbed. I'm keen to debate a science versus patient-centric question. So what motivated these patients and surgeons alike? How were the patient's expectations managed? Looking at organic failures, negligence, and how was this learnt from and importantly recorded? And I've actually curated an original database from my sample of the surviving medical files held at the Royal College of Surgeons, which allows averages and behaviour to be measured, I guess, offering hard data as an original contribution to academia. And importantly, if this standard and model could be replicated and applied for the entirety of what they hold, I think it's something like 2,366 or 7 records in the British section alone. Future research for researchers and family looking into genealogy would become filterable, and they'd also have an extensive range of categories, and they would be no longer reliant, like I was, on a randomised methodological approach. I spoke a little bit earlier about the pensions chapter. I looked at decades worth of correspondence at the National Archives in Kew for around 5 or 6 months last year of disfigured claimants and battles of man versus state, I guess you could say. I wanted to do this to demonstrate that not everybody was fixable, and the emergence of a sort of welfare state was not always just. Disfigurement caused problems until death, and in many cases new problems when elderly, and they were amongst us in the shadows struggling in the 1980s. There will be a large focus on oral history, so interviews with descendants to show the impact on life after disfigurement on those who lived around it, for those who loved or knew a disfigured veteran, asking questions about gendered and generational trauma are really important to me. essentially how living in the shadow of it impacted their children and fascinatingly their children's children. And remarkably, how heartfelt I've found their emotion is when, in many cases, they died when they were incredibly weeny children, or in some places never actually really knew the veteran. So I guess a displacement of emotional impact is what I'm talking about. Before I conclude with a quote, as this talk is one with aspiration of outreach, if you are or know any living descendants of First World War facially disfigured soldiers, please contact me to arrange an interview. I'm actually unsure of the author of this quote, so it's probably not taken verbatim, but I'd very much like to finish on it. For those who left and never returned, and for those that returned but were never the same, today is for them. Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you so much, Ellie. It was incredibly powerful. I'm sure people will agree. And I just think it's really admirable, the way that you have approached this subject. Obviously, it's a really big passion for you, and the memorial itself is just beautiful and such a wonderful tribute. So you must be very, very proud.
Thank you.
So we do have some time for a few questions. There are a few already in the chat, but please do add them in as we go as well. So the first one is, are there still many cases of facial injuries, and has their treatment improved to the extent that there is little news of injuries now? Obviously, they mentioned there the very well-known individual Simon Weston from the Falklands in 1982. But from your knowledge, Ellie, is this something that still happens quite a lot today?
Yeah, so I think I guess we see the move, don't we, from trench warfare, so sort of static lines, to the Second World War is much more mobile. They're more modern warfares with IEDs and things like that, which affect more the extremities, so limbs. But of course, there's still the chance that you're going to be caught in something facially. So I think this is something I was speaking the other day to an academic who's looking a lot at Gaza, and he's saying these numbers, they're things that we just can't get exact figures of now. It's almost virtually impossible. Funny you mentioned Simon Weston. I did interview him in his house last summer, so I thought he'd be an excellent person to speak to about the psychological effects of his wounds. But yeah, things have changed, but a lot of techniques, I guess, that were coined from the First World War are still used now.
Thank you. So Robert has just mentioned that there was an exhibition at the Science Museum in 2017 about the medical services in the First World War, and covered topics like plastic surgery and shell shock. At Imperial War Museum, we also had an exhibition a few years earlier than that, but again, that was looking at medicine. So I'm sure if you go online, you'll be able to find out more about those exhibitions and the collections that were featured. David has asked, he lives very close to Sidcup. Is the memorial in a publicly accessible place if you wanted to go and see it?
Yeah, so if you just go into the, so it's sort of in blocks, but the main entrance to the hospital, you've got the reception, and if you go left, the courtyard is accessible. It tends to be open in the day, so you don't need to sort of disturb anyone or get them to let you in.
It's really good to know, thank you. Mark has said, going back to the wedding photo at the start of the presentation, which was beautiful, and I really love the way that you described it, and it really makes us think. He's asked, was it that the injured man didn't want to be in the forefront of the photo, or do you think his family were hiding him?
I guess because I've only spoken to second generation, if you like, so the grandchildren, from what they've said and how they remember things, which we know can always kind of be warped, but it seemed it was very much his decision, and they were a very, very loving family, very close, very tactile, spent a lot of time together. So I think it was actually them respecting his wishes. Actually, I don't think it was them positioning him. I think they loved him too much and they're too gentle as a family. So I'd definitely say it was Sydney's choice to be half in, half out.
Yeah. Catherine has said that during the Second World War, when Archibald McIndoe was working with RAF pilots who was severely burned, there was a real emphasis on the women nursing staff being a source of support for patients. And did you see something similar to that in the First World War?
Yeah, you can almost. I've looked for. I think with this subject, looking for non-verbal ways of communication has been stronger than say memoirs and things like that. So looking at photo albums, you can see just the positioning of uh, the nurses with them. So they're not sort of just rigidly standing. They've always got their hand on their shoulder, or they're smiling with all teeth. It's not a posed photograph, and they're often immersed or involved in their activities like afternoon teas and things like that, and they would sit and handwrite letters for them or kiss them on the cheek if they asked. So they seemed very, very much involved. If they couldn't go to sleep, they would sneak them a bottle of beer and stuff like that. So I think they were willing to sort of bend the rules, I guess, because yeah, I guess they grew to love them because they lived with them, didn't they, for years.
Yeah, and certainly I know there are examples from the Second World War where I think some of the nurses actually married some of their patients as well and had relationships, which is lovely. Um, John has said he can recall reading that after the First World War, benches in some public spaces were provided for those with facial injuries and painted blue to, in inverted commas, warn other people. Is there evidence of this?
So there isn't anything in terms of blueprints, pardon the pun, of sort of with council drawings and things like that. Some people reject that they actually ever did exist, but I've seen a lot of references to the colour blue with families and their grandchildren who would remember their granddad in blue or the men in blue, and they'd often meet at the blue bench. So I think it's something that colloquially has survived, but it's not something we're ever going to find physical evidence of, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Another comment here, so saying thank you for fascinating, engaging presentation. Interested to know more about the thinking behind choosing the model for the bust and giving a face to the veterans being remembered, thinking about representation, so race, ethnicity, age, etc.
I think with history, sometimes I think for a lot of people, you have to have a disconnect to be able to be connected, which is where I spoke a lot about there. I've had to sort of take care of my mind and all these images that I see, and the impact they have on me, always seeing suffering and being a human, because this is about humanness, I think, all of this. So I think making it the face, my brother, so someone who I looked at and instantly connect to, it feels almost as if the bronze is flesh and I can see my brother Joe in his eyes because it is his eyes. So I think that was my sort of thinking behind it, I guess, to try and make this a history where when we hear and listen about it and talk about it now, to change it so that that could be your brother or it could be your uncle or your dad. So it was a way of closing a gap for me by making it, I think it just changed decisions I made because of what I saw when I looked at it, if that made any sense.
No, definitely, and I think you're right. It's about, you know, almost putting our own feelings to one side and actually thinking we need to represent these individuals as people and look almost beyond the injuries and as you were saying in your presentation, using that kind of idea of the unknown warrior, that this person could represent so many people. um there's just a practical question here from Mark saying the helmet, is it protected from corrosion? Because obviously you mentioned the boots having a hole in so that they don't get waterlogged, but does the helmet get rusty?
You know what? That is something that it is rusting, so it is sort of slightly orangey. But I've been told sort of tips and tricks, to try and keep it. Like for instance, the bronze bust really likes. What's that old fashioned? The tin is like blue stripes, and it's like a liquid.
Oh,
Oh,
Bassa.
that's it. Yeah. So sometimes stuff like that. I've got this sort of black bison wax as well that the helmet seems to like. But yeah, if anybody does have any tricks that they know of material like that to keep it, I suppose it was built to survive outside, so it's doing pretty good. It's over 100 and something years old, but yeah, it's very difficult to know what to put on it because we can't be sure exactly what that one was made of.
Just a comment here from Martin saying that he does tours of Brookwood Military Cemetery, and there's a soldier called Private Mears from Tasmania buried there. He spent 2 years at Sidcup when his jaw was blown away. Unfortunately, he died on the operation table from a heart attack on the final procedure, but on the tours he shows the kind of before and after photos of the surgery. So that's just a really nice way of keeping that story alive, isn't it? Just a couple more questions before we wrap up. So Glenn has said it's a very interesting presentation. From your research, what proportion of those saved in the hospital would have preferred to have died rather than live with their disfigurement? Obviously, that's a very emotive question. I suppose it's difficult to tell, but have you come across any accounts that suggest that?
That's not possible, I guess, for me, unfortunately, to answer. Um, I guess the desperation you has come through in some cases. So Gillies wrote a couple of books after where he reflected on cases that he treated during the war. So he obviously was seeing thousands. So you can see how some of these anecdotes he remembered per face obviously sort of were seared into him. But there's one soldier in particular where he reflects that he actually said to him, if you don't do this surgery, so essentially he wanted it all done in one go instead of a piecemeal approach that would have taken, say, years. He said if you don't do it, he threatened to commit suicide, as if to say, I would rather take that huge risk and die than continue to look in this way. He actually did die after the surgery. So I think with that, we need to be careful of, everybody's got different versions of the truth, don't they? And he can't speak for himself now. But it's important, yeah. There were people, I guess, that were sort of bargaining their lives at the risk.
Absolutely. And just one final question before we wrap up. So, there are a few still coming in, which is great. And what we can do is perhaps share them with Ellie afterwards and then share the answers with everyone. But yeah, there's one here about the design of the memorial. So your first design had their face completely covered by their hands, but then you shifted to where it was just on one side of the face. Was there a particular reason for that?
I think, if I'm totally honest, I didn't know how good it was going to come out, because it was the 3D printer that I had. He was used to doing, I don't know if anybody's seen their miniatures where he can create you, but you're like this size. So it was his first job, I guess, essentially, of creating something that's to scale. So that is slightly bigger than to scale the bust. So I think where at first it was two hands covering the whole face, I wasn't sure if it would translate and it would be clear it was a face. So I thought best to keep one side out. So yeah, that answer is not particularly imaginative. I think it was just me, not being sure of how good it was going to be.
That's great, thank you. So I'm just popping in the chat box there Ellie's email address if you do have any further questions. Obviously, as she's already said, if you know of anybody who has a direct link to some of the soldiers we've been talking about, she'd love to hear about it as well. So Yeah, we're pretty much at time, so I'll draw it to a close. I'd just like to say thank you so much, Ellie, for such a powerful presentation, for sharing your research with us. Thank you all as well for your very thoughtful and insightful questions as well. Please do get in touch with Ellie if there's anything else you'd like to know. And we are going to be sending out a survey to everyone after the event. So if you could please let us know what you thought about the presentation on there, that would be incredibly helpful. So for now, I'd like to end the session. Thank you all very much for coming, and we hope to see you again at a future event. Thank you. Bye-bye.